This is the world's most famous top secret plane, but did you know that it almost didn't look like this? In fact, it was just one of the many designs that almost got built. From chonky liquid hydrogen monster, strange balloon-powered towing kite, to the ultimate spy plane. But its evolution wouldn't stop there, taking on more aggressive roles like a hypersonic bomber defense craft, a tactical nuke launcher, and carrying a spacecraft on its back. And that's not to mention the further black projects like the SR-72, the mysterious Aurora, and perhaps even the SR-75 that may have been built after retirement of this famous aircraft. But the fact is that the SR-71 seemed to appear from nowhere and has since had no equal, developing seemingly without a history. After all, there wasn't a series of previous aircraft leading to its eventual dominance, so it makes you wonder how on earth it came to be. Or perhaps consider that it wasn't on Earth that it came to be and that the US had some help from beings from another world. However, that story is no longer the case, and thanks to the spectacular research done by Scott Lawther at Aerospace Projects Review and his sources in his book, the evolution of this fantastical aircraft from a mere dream to something real life is finally illuminated. So welcome to the Found and Explained deep dive into the Blackbird. Where did it come from? What insane designs never got built for the project? And what is the mysterious successor aircraft to the legendary SR-71? Do you want to own a piece of the SR-71 and carry it around with you every day? I'm serious. You can actually pre-order right now a watch that's made from the titanium of the SR-71. And this is seriously one of the coolest opportunities I've ever had the pleasure of seeing here on the channel. It's called the Habu watch. Not only is this watch made from the aircraft's inner engine nacelle exhaust ejector titanium alloys, but it's also got a Swiss-made movement with up to 50 meters water resistance. You'll notice that the design echoes cockpit gauges with the power reserve indicator at 6 o'clock, mimicking the unique triathyrobrane throttle management system, essential for ignition at high speeds and altitudes, and the strap designed to look like the nose step on the aircraft's wings. And you're probably wondering which actual SR-71 was it made from? Well, it's actually the Special B variant, the trainer version, number 617956, which had a unique double cockpit and was used to train the pilots for the program. It completed 1,454 flights and nearly 4,000 flight hours, more than any other SR-71 in history. In fact, it's the one that's always pictured in the photos. So in a way, wearing this, you're part of the training program for the fastest production aircraft ever made. It's just so cool, and I'm actually honestly geeking out about this. But if that's not your cup of tea, they also have watches from other machines, such as a DeLorean like Back to the Future, a Supermarine Spitfire, and even a Formula 1 car. But I don't come empty-handed. You can use my code FOUND to get 15% off this watch or any other on the REC site. Plus, their current sale on top, which is already $500 off this watch. So if you're looking for a present for yourself or someone you love, use my code FOUND. Act fast though, because it's a super limited edition, and once it's gone, it's actually gone. Because they're not making any more SR-71s, and you can't make any more watches from nothing. In the early 1950s, the spy game between the US and the Soviet Union was in full swing. Not only did both sides employ everything from binoculars to deep undercover agents, they also performed regular aerial surveillance. The United States thought that if they could get an aircraft up high enough, it would be impervious to Russian counterattacks, despite flying in plain sight. They accomplished this with the U-2 Dragon Lady, essentially an F-104 with a very large wing that could fly enormously out of the range of the current Soviet missiles. Well, for now. They knew that as soon as the Soviets figured out how to shoot them down, then they would need a jet that not only flew higher, but was also a lot faster. And the problem with that formula is that back then they couldn't develop an engine that could push the aircraft that fast or work that high. But you know what did fly fast and high up in the 1950s? Rockets.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
That's right, liquid hydrogen rockets were smashing records left and right, and might even put a man on the moon one day. So the engineers at that time wondered if they could develop some sort of rocket spy plane. Liquid hydrogen, when burned with oxygen, can produce multitudes more thrust than normal jet fuel, such as gasoline, kerosene, or any other hydrocarbons that the military were currently using. But liquid hydrogen has two major problems. The first is that it has to be cooled to a staggering negative 253 degrees to remain liquid. Yikes. And the second is that the actual volume of the material required to produce the same thrust is significantly more, thanks to 7% of the liquid hydrogen being water. So this would mean that these new aircraft would have to be comically huge and have large rocket-looking fuel tanks. In fact, the initial designs would use the same tanks as the Atlas ICBM. And who better to come up with this first design than the predecessor of NASA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NACA. Let's break down their idea for this high-speed, high-altitude spy aircraft. It would be hydrogen-fueled, of course, with a long body, 4 turbojet engines, and a single crew compartment. It was designed to fly at an altitude of 80,000 feet at Mach 2.5, using the burning fuel to not only get up to its top speed, but then as the aircraft emptied the fuel, the airframe would become lighter and rise to a higher altitude. Perfect for spying. The engines would be created by a company called Garrett Corporation, who had been hard at work on their new liquid hydrogen turbojet engines, and would bring all the advantages of jet engine design without the rocket engine flaws. It's at this stage of the story that our hero, Lockheed, was called in.
Those damn Soviets are trying to put nukes in Cuba. Quick, we gotta break the sound barrier tunnel. Garrett Corporation.
The Air Force, who were interested in the spy plane design from the NACA, decided that the engine builders shouldn't also build the actual aircraft and wanted to split up the program. Thus, the Garrett Corporation invited their friends Lockheed to come in and build the airframe for their aircraft concept to ensure that they still had some control and maintained that engine contract. And boy, did they bring some pretty wacky ideas to the table. Lockheed put veteran designer Kelly Johnson on the case, and his first design was dubbed the CL-325-1. Johnson would pretty much run with the NACA concept and just outline the details. This giant aluminum beast would have an equally giant fuel tank running throughout the entire fuselage, with a small cockpit at the front and camera equipment stored in the nose. Now, keen-eyed viewers at home will realise that this looks just like a giant bloated F-104, also by Lockheed, which, as you recall from 2 minutes ago, was the same starting point for the U-2 spy plane. So much of the design language of this project was borrowed from these earlier jets. At the same time, Lockheed would also propose a smaller but heavy CL-325-2. Now, the second version would look roughly the same but have jettisonable fuel tanks on the wings to allow the aircraft to remove the empty weight of the fuel tanks once the aircraft was flying high enough. Of course, such a design would be significantly more expensive per flight and wouldn't be the best direction to take the program. Garrett would take these two designs and staple them to the end of their engine report and submit it to the Air Force, ready for construction, and the paychecks would soon be on the way. Well, not quite. The report alarmed the Air Force, who were surprised with just how big these proposed aircraft were and concerned about the lack of experience that Garrett would have working with hydrogen engines. Thus, they decided to pass up completely on the project. But this, my friends, is where the story gets a little wild. Kelly Johnson, the designer of the aircraft thus far, actually went to the Air Force and said, "Hey, we made the U-2 aircraft for the CIA, which now they use exclusively. The Air Force doesn't want to miss out on the opportunity for their own Lockheed spy plane." The Air Force, who were still quite bitter that they didn't have the highest flying jet in the world anymore, took the bait and actually suggested that Lockheed continue to work on the airframe with a new, then unknown, engine builder. Talk about balls. This would now be a new program, and a new program needs a new name. Suntan, based off the fact that the sun ran on hydrogen. The Air Force asked Lockheed to go away and come back with a third design, no longer hampered by the engine restrictions from Garrett. And this is what they came up with. They called it the CL400, and it would have some significant differences from the earlier versions. For one, it would have 3 fuel tanks now instead of one larger one to allow for better control of the center of gravity as the plane flew. It would also have a ventricle fin that would mean the main wing would no longer have to be anhedral. Lastly, the cockpit was expanded and the pilots from it would get a pretty fantastic view. Oh yes, I mentioned there's now 2 pilots on board this plane, but this wasn't without its own flaws. After 6 months' work, the range of the aircraft was found to be lacking. It would have to be refueled between flying from mainland USA to Soviet airspace. And this would mean either in-air refueling, which in the late 1950s was still in its infancy, or ground-based refueling at an Allied airbase, probably in a country outside of America. But hey, I forgot to remind you guys, this was all hydrogen fuel. This meant that they would need infrastructure for hydrogen, either in air refueling or ground refueling, which would be a significant outlay for a single spy aircraft. Essentially, flying the actual plane didn't make any economical sense. So Lockheed was asked to go back to the drawing board and in a frantic attempt to solve the range problems of this aircraft, rapidly evolved the concept. The first of the new versions was the CL400-10. This aircraft, the main hydrogen tanks were now done away with and the wings were turned into fuel tanks. But this wasn't enough. The second version, the CL400-11, had the engines also integrated into the wings as well. Now working with Pratt & Whitney, Lockheed would place the 2 engines within the wing fuselage instead of being on the wingtips. The aircraft was also now 40 feet longer and had double the fuel capacity of the original base model, essentially trying to solve the range issues through brute force. Next, we got up to the -12 version, which would have 4 engines and be 100 feet longer than that of the original, massively increasing the range by 2,500 nautical miles. So if going bigger worked, then Lockheed would double down on this and now make a 300-foot long version with the -13. They would scrap the current hydrogen tank design that had thus far been so popular and go all in on a delta wing. They would scale up the engines as well by 125% somehow, I'm not sure if they told Pratt & Whitney, and the whole thing could potentially fly at Mach 4 for 9,000 nautical miles. But it was insanely huge. I'm not sure it would even fit on a normal runway. So for the -14, they went back to the smaller design, but with the learnings of the -13, they could maintain that high speed of Mach 4, but with a reduced range. While they were preparing to submit the -14 to the Air Force, they also decided to throw in something else. In a Hail Mary move, they created a jet fuel version, scrapping the idea of hydrogen power entirely, calling it the -15 JP, for jet powered. This was to show that the plane design was sound and that the fancy new fuel source wasn't specifically required. Alas, for all their efforts, by 1959, interest in the program came to an end and the Air Force would ultimately cancel Project Suntan. But like all good ideas, Lockheed wasn't going to give up just yet. So at this point of the story, it would be important to mention that there were other attempts at building this super aircraft. You see, the U-2 spy plane at the time was still on a need-to-know basis for the CIA, and various members of the Air Force would actually duplicate their efforts to build its successor, as they didn't know about the Lockheed hydrogen jet program or many details about the U-2 itself. Thus, we had other aircraft like the Bell Systems concept, the North American concept, and the famous Convair Fish, which was attached to the amazing B-58 Hustler, all in the running to become America's new spy plane. Now, all of these aircraft deserve a future video on the topic, and it wouldn't do it justice as a footnote in today's video. So be sure to subscribe if you want to see more about these aircraft, because I would love to deep dive into these other designs. But what you do need to know for today is that Convair was very close to winning the contract for this super spy plane, and throughout the evolution of the SR-71, Convair was nipping at Lockheed's heels. We'll hear about their progress throughout the next part of this tale. So back to our story, Lockheed was in the dumps after the Air Force program was shut down, but there was still interest from the CIA. The problem was that damn hydrogen. But remember that jet-fueled version that they proposed right at the end of the Suntan program? Well, Kelly Johnson knew that there was something more to that. Advancements in Soviet radar technology by the end of the 1950s had started to change the proposed requirements that the CIA was looking for a potential future spy plane. They knew that it needed to now fly at Mach 3 at 90,000 feet to remain undetected and have a cross-section of only 10 square meters or less. Because the U-2 no longer fit into these requirements, the CIA would need a new plane built from the ground up, and thus they called Kelly Johnson and said, "Can you make us a U-3? As naturally this would be the next aircraft in the series, but that name wouldn't stick, rather the program would become the more famous Archangel. Now, just like with the previous hydrogen aircraft, the very first version of the Archangel was actually rather basic. It had a conventional 1950s supersonic aircraft configuration, similar to that of the B-58, and a highly unusual tail. I mean, look at that thing being thrown back. But this concept was enough to get the powers to authorize a series run to design this new spy plane, and the team at Lockheed got to work on its evolution. A-1, the first actual design, did away with the large tail and refined the fuselage. This is where titanium was chosen as the material of choice, and the aluminium of the previous hydrogen plane was discarded. It would have high shouldered mounted wings, a pair of J-58 turbojets under each one, and there was also some large ramjets proposed for the wingtips, but note that the added weight would reduce the range. But this is where something really funny happened, that during this year, and while the team was working on the A-1 design, the Navy actually came along for their own high-speed spy plane, and knew that Lockheed had built the U-2 and thought that they could build one for them, although this one would have to be launched at altitude from a Goodyear blimp. Kelly Johnson was against this idea from the start, saying that to launch such a heavy plane, the balloon would need to be a mile wide, hugely impractical. But the Navy insisted, and Lockheed spent a few months developing what they called a ramjet kite. The cockpit would be in the middle of a ramjet with swept wings behind the aircraft. But even more wild, Lockheed proposed to do away with the balloon and then build the Navy A-Tug aircraft called a Peterbilt. It would be a large 4-turbojet subsonic aircraft that would tow the ramjet up to 70,000 feet at Mach 0.8 before the spycraft would use rockets to get underway. The concept, while cool, was impractical, expensive, and complicated, and Lockheed couldn't meet the Navy's range requirements, and thus they dropped development to return to the CIA Archangel program. And speaking of, the second design was almost ready. Archangel 2, or A-2, would increase the wing area to improve range and altitude performance, and the engines were now moved out of the fuselage to solve the problem of turbulent airflow. However, having both ramjets and the engines on the outside, as well as plenty of sharp right angles, it made it practically unstealthy, so Lockheed would need to drastically improve the radar cross-section with the next design. Called A-3, the idea was to make the plane as small as possible. Remember that 10 meters limit that the CIA had asked for? Well, these concepts would have to be tiny, which would get their own cute sub-series nickname, Cherub, which Lockheed would make 4. The first, Cherub 1, was a stubby tailless delta concept with turbojets integrated into the fuselage, with the ramjets having flattened wingtip pods. The elliptical shape was an attempt at reducing the radar cross-section, alas the vertical stabilizer was a big radar reflector. Cherub 2 would have smaller, sharper swept wings, and have circular inlets instead of flattened pods. This was proposed to improve airflow and reduce the wing's weight, increasing the range. Cherub 3 was a flying wing concept with a long pointed nose, with both the turbojets and ramjets integrated inside. According to Scott Lawther, the author of the excellent book that this video is based on, the concept would use high temperature fiberglass throughout instead of titanium, making it quite cheaper. Cherub 4 would combine many of the concepts and would be submitted to the Department of Defense as a proposal. It would be pretty wild, with a claustrophobic cockpit filled with nitrogen air. The pilot would have to wear a Navy diving suit for pressurization and have no ejecting seat. Yes, that's right, the pilot would not be able to eject from this concept. Lockheed believed that this aircraft could fly 2 missions a day up to 2,000 nautical miles, which didn't go down that well with the military. You see, there were other concepts at the time, such as the Convair fish, that were more attractive, particularly with range and logistics. So Lockheed was asked to go back to the drawing board for a 4th version. Gosh, doesn't this all start to sound familiar? This next stage of the evolution has some fascinating aircraft, and while I'd love to sit down and slowly go through each design detail, I wouldn't be able to do it justice. So strap in and prepare for rapid mode. The A-4 was a particular looking aircraft with a curving radar defeating cross-section and 2 ramjets under the wingtips, as well as inlets under the aircraft for a single turbojet engine. Unless the range was found lacking and Lockheed moved on. The A-5 had 2 engines and a single large ramjet, swapping around the previous configuration. But unlike the other designs, this aircraft would also have a rocket engine. That's right, the rocket would boost the plane up to the required speed to turn on the massive ramjet. Pretty damn cool. But what's not so cool is the complexity of the design, plus the lack of range. The A6 followed the A5's cool as heck design and was a significant upgrade from the previous iterations. It would have a S-shaped inlet for the engine for stealth and 2 other inlets for the double ramjets. Gone was the long curving fuselage, replaced by 2 vertical stabilizers that were canted inboard to reduce the radar reflection. Alas, the performance of this design could still be improved. At the same time that this was all under development, Lockheed was asked to check Convair's homework with their 2-stage aircraft spy-plane concept called the Fish by designing their own Lockheed version. They came up with 2, the Lockheed Arrow that was a sharply swept Delta aircraft, and the other one with the name the B-58 launched vehicle, which had little doors on the wings to let the B-58 wheels pass through during takeoff, and would fill much of the same role as the Convair Fish. The designs did prove that the concept would work, but there were still some problems like no ability to eject when attached to the B-58. By now, Lockheed was in a quagmire. Small aircraft were better at avoiding radar detection, but didn't have any range. So Kelly Johnson made a call to scrap trying to avoid radar and instead focus on the range for the A7 series. Looking much like the original A1, this aircraft went back to the ramjets on the wings and turbojets integrated inside in a hope to improve the aerodynamic capability. To increase the range, Lockheed had the idea to do supersonic refueling with a second A7 tanker aircraft, but yikes to that idea. From here, the designs moved rather quickly from the A7 to the A10, with 8 and 9 both failing to meet the range requirements. But this is where Lockheed had a breakthrough. The A10 was made to go so fast that radar would not be a worry. It would have a large vertical stabilizer, shoulder-mounted diamond wings, and multiple turbojets in undersling nacelles. Lockheed would also upgrade the engines with the J93s that were found on the XB70. Kelly Johnson was really confident by this point and believed that the next version, the A11, would nail the requirements. And Lockheed had an ace up their sleeve. Gone were the wing-tipped ramjets, but instead the aircraft would have two turbojets that could operate as afterburners. Now, the trick here is that these afterburning engines would not do it in short bursts, but rather operate continuously, mimicking that of the role of the ramjet. This would mean two separate fuels would be required for flight, specifically the JB-150 for normal flight and HEF-3 for the afterburners. Lockheed would show this aircraft to the Air Force and the CIA, who would be comparing it to the rival Convair Fish, finding the latter lacking. You see, the A11 was superior, cheaper to produce, cheaper to maintain, cheaper to operate. It would require 8 times less staff to run missions than that of the Convair Fish, and most of all, it didn't have a carrier aircraft like the B-58. Plus, refueling the A11 in flight with a standard tanker aircraft that could carry normal fuel allowed the aircraft to have range enough for all of the Soviet territory, and could be based at a single mainland USA top secret Air Force base. Perfect. But you might be a fool to think that Convair would take this rejection of their famous fish lying down. They would storm back to the Air Force and CIA with an updated version called the Kingfish. It was now a single aircraft that could nearly match the performance that of the Lockheed A11, but have double the stealth capability. So Lockheed needed to make the A11 as stealthy as possible with a smaller radar cross-section. So they got to work. They took the A11 and had its fuselage blended together, its wings lowered to nearly the bottom of the aircraft, its rectangular inlets were replaced by circular ones, and the large vertical stabilizer was split in two and added to the engine nacelles. The performance did suffer slightly. It would no longer be able to fly as high, but it would be much more invisible. The engine was locked in as the J-58, and Lockheed returned to the Air Force with their concept for the final face-off, in which, and this shouldn't surprise you, a good 25 minutes into the video, Lockheed won. Not only was the Lockheed concept superior, but Convair also passed over, because unlike Lockheed's excellent proven ability with the U-2 spy plane, Convair had blown out its budget with the B-58 and lacked a secure research and development facility like the Lockheed Skunk Works. Impressed, the military shook hands with Lockheed and told them that they had 18 months to build their miracle aircraft. And thus, the Mach 3 spy plane, the A-12, was born. After the initial design was approved, the final version that we know as the A-12 today went through many more changes. One of the initial proposals, which included chines, also included canards to provide stability in flight, as well as changes to the design of the vertical stabilizers, where the trailing engines were now swept forward, the rudder removed, making it an all-moving vertical stabilizer that we saw down the line even with the YF-23 Black Widow. The final design, however, saw engineers dropping the canards and keeping these new vertical stabilizers. But the event in May of 1960 placed an exclamation mark on the A-12 development. In 1957, the Soviets introduced a new AA system in service under the name S-75 Dvina. A giant 10-meter long two-stage missile, weighing over 2 tons, was the pride of the Soviet anti-air defense that could shoot down enemy jets as high as 80,000 feet. And in 1960, the previously untouchable U-2 spy plane, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, was shot down over Soviet territory while performing a daring mission to penetrate the Soviet airspace deeper than ever before. This was a big win for the Soviets. Propaganda-wise, they paraded an American pilot and showed the world that no one was safe if they dared to mess with the USSR. But for Lockheed, this was a big slap in their face, showing them that now the USSR had the technological capability to shoot down their new spy plane. The first A-12 was ready and transferred to Area 51 just a year later, but there were still problems to be solved. Lowering the radar cross-section was something that was hard to measure and even harder to engineer, so several approaches were made with zigzag-shaped foam and titanium plates in chines and leading-edge surfaces. But in the end, a special composite panel was created with a honeycomb structure and small, almost microscopic graphene spheres. A crazy skin of the aircraft that very well could potentially make it invisible. They would need to test this in flight against American radars, but engines were not yet available, so the first 3 prototypes were equipped with Pratt & Whitney J75 engines, which could push the plane over Mach 2 but not up to the required Mach 3. After assembling the first prototype at Area 51, issues started popping up with the fuel tank sealant, so the aircraft was leaking fuel massively, which in the end would actually become a feature of the A-12 and the SR-71. Now you're probably wondering, all this fuel on the ground would actually be a big issue, but actually the jet fuel was not flammable at lower temperatures, and even if you threw a match into the puddle, it would not ignite it. So to get around this, they created a special chemical called TEB, which was used in a small canister and injected into the engine on startup to ignite the fuel. The problem with this was that this chemical was extremely flammable and dangerous. We're talking about 3,000 degrees temperature whilst it's burning, and since it was lighter than water, if you tried to put it out, it would just float to the surface of the puddle and ignite again when mixed with oxygen. So it would only be used once the engines were started. But about that, because that was another issue. Starting up the beast that was the J58s was a problem of its own. You couldn't use your regular starter, so instead 2 massive Buick V8 engines with an output of over 600 horsepower were used as a starter for the A-12, and all the variants down the line. America, hell yeah! Engines were located in large nacelles on each wing, and massive inlet cones, or spikes if you will, were designed to break the flow of the supersonic air flowing into the engines and bring it down to a subsonic speed so the engine compressor would be able to work properly. As the speed increased, the inlet cone would move further to restrict and slow the air intake, while the panels on the nacelles would allow for over-pressurized air to leave where needed. So you could imagine being a general walking in on the project in 1962 and seeing a big heaping mess of graphene on the floor with leaking fuel everywhere and 2 massive V8 engines rumbling away in the corner. But by late 1962, the J58 engines were delivered and finally installed into the aircraft, and the A-12 flew for the first time with its new engines. Dialing in the design from here, the A-12 would break the Mach 2 barrier, and in July of the same year, Mach 3 was attained. As flight testing continued, they were able to get it up to a cruising speed of Mach 3.2 for an hour and 15 minutes, completing all of the basic program requirements by 1965. But the A-12 was more than just raw power, it was also about reconnaissance and electronics. The aircraft was equipped with state-of-the-art cameras with 5,000 feet or 1.5 kilometers of film, allowing for 1,980 photographs to be taken during one mission. The camera featured a gimbal that would stabilize it even if the plane was shaking and always pointed downwards. Even though the A-12 was flying high and extremely fast, the CIA wanted to play on the safeguard, so a whole suite of countermeasures was installed under the code name Supermarket. The Walmart on the A-12 included radar warning receivers and jammers working against in both targeting and detection radar frequencies. So with the plane mostly ready by the 1960s, it was time for its first combat mission, and that finally occurred in May of 1967. An A-12 flew from Kadena Air Base in Japan over North Vietnam at an altitude of 80,000 feet and cruising at Mach 3.1, taking pictures of enemy SAM sites and radars. In December of the same year, during one of the other missions, a total of 6 missile launches were detected, but it seems only one small segment of one of the missiles managed to nick the lower wing root. The aircraft was seemingly invulnerable. In total, 27 recon missions were performed, with the Air Force very impressed with this design. It was time for the next version. As the XF-108 program was being abandoned, the wish and need for a Mach 3 interceptor was growing stronger again. The A-12 was the most prospective program of the era and would be the sound solution to this problem, with some major tweaks of course. As early as 1961, concepts appeared calling for a new concept, AF-12. In 1962, this program started rolling rapidly and the designation was changed to the YF-12 program, with work on 3 prototypes being finished just a year later. The YF-12 was a combat aircraft that required obviously 2 things, a radar and missiles. The nose section of the A-12 was heavily modified to house an AN/APG-18 radar previously developed for the Rapier, giving the YF-12 a rounded nose cone. Forward chines were also cut short and one infrared search and track sensor was housed on each side. Unlike the A-12, the YF-12 had a crew of 2, a pilot and weapon systems officer. The aft fuselage would mostly remain the same except for a large ventricle fin in the middle of the lower fuselage. All of the spy equipment was removed to make room for weapons and electronics, with 3 weapon bays with missiles and 1 compartment housing weapons control systems. And let's talk about these weapons. The YF-12 was to be equipped with GAR-9 long-range missiles, again developed for the XF-108, and better known as the AIM-47. Just as the prototype was performing its flight tests, President Lyndon Johnson commented on its displays to the public.
The United States has successfully developed an advanced experimental jet aircraft, the A-11, which has been tested in sustained flight at more than 2,000 miles an hour and at altitudes in excess of 70,000 feet.
But this was not a case of ignorance, but rather a well-thought-up scheme by Kelly Johnson and the CIA to divert Soviet attention from the main A-12 reconnaissance project, because they suspected that the KGB had breached the Skunk Works. As I mentioned 15 minutes ago, the A-11 was a previous thrown-away concept, and the Soviets, thinking that this was only an interceptor, the true purpose of the program would stay well hidden. The YF-12 was tested then along with a new radar and missiles and managed to shoot down an aerial target dummy whilst flying it over Mach 3, but it never entered serial production of 2 main reasons. The Vietnam War was putting a strain on resources, and Mach 3 interceptors became obsolete by the late 1960s because of nuclear ICBMs, that were the new kid in the block, and bombers carrying nuclear bombs were now a thing of the past. Lockheed still thought there was merit to the idea, so they proposed changing the YF-12 program to the FB-12, standing for Mach 3 Fighter Bomber. This would have a chinned nose again and a mix of air-to-ground and air-to-air weaponry. This aircraft would have a loadout of 4 AGM-69 SRAMs armed with nuclear warheads, or a combination of AIM-7s and AGMs. However, none of these concepts would come to life. One of the YF-12 prototypes was converted into a Sol SR-71C, while the other 2 were passed over to NASA and be used for flight testing over the next couple of years. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because there was one other version of the A-12 that would get rid of what some people saw as the ultimate flaw: the human on board. Remember how the Soviet Union had managed to shoot down Powers in his U-2 aircraft? Well, that made the CIA question even themselves, even though they had an engineering marvel in their garage. The fact that there was a pilot in the cockpit made a lot of people in Langley anxious. In the CIA asked Skunk Works and Kelly Johnson himself to develop an alternative craft with the A-12 technology without the pilot behind the controls. The first concept called for an unmanned F-104 carried by the A-12, and then it would be launched mid-air to complete the recon mission without the A-12 entering the Soviet airspace, but the idea was quickly rejected by the CIA. So Kelly Johnson proposed something wild. Skunk Works would develop a sort of baby A-12, a drone powered by a ramjet instead of a turbojet engine. It would be called the D-21 and would have a similar radar cross-section reduction just like the A-12. It would have large and flat delta wings continuing into chines that would give the drone a distinctive look, all while forming a substantial anhedral. These drones would have been made from composites, while the central metallic structure housed the main engine. It wouldn't be a J-58 from the A-12, but a ramjet instead. Ramjets of course need a starting speed to work, but since the A-12 was going to carry the recon drone anyway, this was the perfect option, all whilst getting that sweet maximum speed over Mach 3. But you're probably wondering, how on earth would this work? Because we're talking about a stealth spy drone in the 1960s, well before any sort of incredible computer technology. The mothership, which got the designation M12, would carry the drone to the launch position, and then after the drone was launched, it would fly on its pre-programmed route with a maximum of 16 waypoints and take pictures with spy cameras located in a so-called hatch. After the mission was done and the drone left the Soviet airspace, the hatch would be jettisoned and picked up mid-air by a modified C-130, whilst the drone itself would self-destruct so the enemy wouldn't be able to get their hands on the tech. Sounds complicated, right? Well, it was. One M12 was lost in an accident due to the drone malfunctioning after launch, and several other test launches, except for one, were completely unsuccessful. The CIA was ready to pull the plug on this drone program, but the Air Force wanted this because they saw some potential. So they pressed on, and the D-21 drone would actually fly a total of 4 real missions, with all 4 of them being complete failures. One drone crashed over the USSR and the Soviets got their hands on the remains, and another one crashed in China and the Chinese found the wreck. The Soviets even explored the idea of reverse engineering it with the Tupolev Voron project, but decided to not pursue it further. It seems that they had more sense than the Americans. Nixon then axed the program because he didn't want to spoil relations with China, and that was it for the D-21. Several other A-12 concepts were proposed by Lockheed to keep the program going, for satellite launcher or a carrier-based plane, all the way to a classic bomber, but none of them were actually built, and instead a universal A-12 was proposed, and that became what we know as the SR-71. Back in 1962, Kelly Johnson from Lockheed had a vision for the future of the A-12 program, and that was money. This aircraft was not only going to be for the CIA and the Men in Black, but also for the Air Force and perhaps even the Navy. There would be a fighter jet variant, a bomber, a recon aeroplane, and it would all be based on one modular platform called the R-12. Now, changing a name from A-12 to R-12 makes a lot of sense, but how on earth did we get the SR-71? Well, you can see the XB-70 program fell apart around about this time, and there was supposed to be a proposed variant of it that would be a reconnaissance strike version called the RS-70. Because that wasn't moving forward anymore, Lockheed would propose its new R-12 version would take the role of that and called it the RS-71. And now this next part is pretty much speculations, but apparently in 1964, the Republican candidate in the upcoming election called out President Lyndon Johnson, saying that how weak the US is and that it was falling behind the USSR when it came to future weapons development. Johnson decided that he wanted to flex, so as we mentioned before, he revealed to the public the existence of the A-11, but when pressed, also said there was a new version on the way called the SR-71. He misspelled the designation of this new aircraft, and apparently everybody just went along with it. This may have been because General Curtis LeMay, the Chief of Staff of the US Air Force, preferred the new SR designation, meaning Strategic Reconnaissance, instead of the old Reconnaissance Strike. So the other story is that he lobbied the President Johnson before the speech to name the new plane the SR-71 instead of the RS-71, even though that's what he said in his speech. This version sounds much more plausible, but hey, you can trust either one of these because both are cool stories. So what was the catch with the SR-71 and how did it actually differ from the A-12? Well, first of all, the size of the fuselage was increased slightly with a distinctive tail boom, and this made much more room for fuel. Instead of a so-called Q-bay, the compartment that housed the camera, room was made for another pilot, who could either be a weapons system officer or a reconnaissance system officer. Instead of one, the new plane would have two main cameras for spy missions and another smaller resolution camera capturing the path of the aircraft to prevent any political issues and counter accusations of entering a country's airspace. The SR-71 would also be carrying new side and forward-looking radars with synthetic aperture for terrain mapping, as well as a new DEF-A threat detection system. For navigation, the SR-71 would also use a new astro-inertial system. Remember, this was a time before satellites and GPS, so a sensor would be scanning the sky and finding stars and constellations for navigation. And with a very accurate chronometer, it would be able to determine the position of the aircraft within a circle of roughly 100 meters. And since the SR-71 was flying at 80,000 feet, the sky would always be clear and dark, with stars that were well visible in either day or night time. As with the case with the previous variant of our protagonist, the A-12, the SR-71 would come in several variants. So if you're the Air Force, be sure to get your pocketbook because it's time to go shopping. So your basic SR-71 came in three variants. There was the A version, the most numerous, the standard two-seater reconnaissance. There was B, the trainer aircraft, and there was C, which we already mentioned was actually part YF-12 and part fuselage of a static test SR-71 model. It was nicknamed the Bastard, and I can see why. Big Tail was also one of the SR-71 prototypes in 1975. It featured, well, a big tail, or more precisely, a stinger of sorts that was proposed for housing new advanced electronic countermeasures. In the end, it was used for housing the camera and making more room in the nose section for a side-looking radar. The B-71 was a proposed bomber variant featuring a triple bomb bay on each side of the fuselage for carrying tactical nuclear bombs. But instead of a first strike bomber, it would actually be used to mop up any remaining Soviet missile silos or AA sites that had survived the initial ICBM exchange. Now remember those YF-12 prototypes transferred over to NASA for testing? Well, one of them was lost in an accident, and NASA got a replacement SR-71 instead and called it the YF-12C. This plane tested the idea of carrying and launching missiles like the AIM-7 or AIM-9 on pylons at high supersonic speeds. But then NASA decided to make it even more interesting. Since one of the main NASA projects at the time was the Space Shuttle, and the SR-71 was in sort of the same shape as the shuttle, NASA thought that they could get useful data from high altitude speed tests. They went further by attaching a 1/10th scale model of the shuttle on the YF-12 fuselage, and it was even tested an early design scale model of the new B-1 bomber. By this point in time, Lockheed was hungry again for more sales, and they proposed the SR-71BX, which was another bomber variant that would have 4 AGM-69 SRAM tactical nukes on board, and pretty much a very similar concept to the FB-12 that we already mentioned before. And since it seems like Lockheed wants to keep bringing back previous aircraft, they also re-proposed an interceptor version. It would be called the SR-71 and it would feature an AN/APG-65 radar from an FA-18 Hornet and 4 newly developed AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles. It could penetrate Soviet airspace and perform an interception of a Soviet bomber before they even knew what hit them. Lockheed proposed modifying 7 airframes for this purpose, but the plan was never put into action. But it does make me laugh, because imagine a MiG-31 intercepting a Mach 3 SR-71 aircraft, which is also intercepting at Mach 3, and then a surprise when you get a radar lock from the SR-71. Damn, America. There was also a variant that would be used as a testbed for a hypersonic aircraft, but let's talk about the deployment and the actual service history of the SR-71A. The SR-71 entered service in 1964 and flew missions until retirement in 1989. Hey, that's when I was born. Then it was brought back from retirement, but you know how sequels after retirement always get bad? Well, it was the same story with a Blackbird. Politics and money went into play, and in the end, it was officially retired in 1998, with NASA retiring the final 2 airworthy airframes by 1999. By the end of the 80s, satellites had become the main spy tool, and the introduction of the new Soviet interceptor, the MiG-31, flights deep into the Soviet territory stopped. In total, the SR-71 family flew 3,551 missions, and during its career, around 800 missiles were shot at Blackbirds with not a single loss. Several planes crashed due to malfunctions, but only one crew member, Jim Zweyer, was killed in an accident, with all the others ejecting safely. The Blackbird was insanely complicated to operate and fly, and would require extensive work on the ground to even prepare for the plane to take off. Rob Vermland, Lockheed's Advanced Programs Manager, explained this beautifully in an interview. "If we had one sitting in the hangar here and the crew chief told us that it was a mission planned right now, then 19 hours later, it would be safe to take off." But the SR-71 proved to be an invaluable piece of machinery and a spy plane with a clean record. Oh, you're still here? The story of the SR-71 is over. Oh, you want to know what happened next? Well, this is where we enter the real vague period of time, and forgive me, this is where we also drop the highly accurate book written by my excellent friend Scott Lawther at Aerospace Projects Review, and put on tinfoil instead. The actual government answer is that spy satellites took over for the SR-71 for the next few decades, with Lockheed agreeing to build this new spy plane as the last generation replacement for the U-2 before space tools would be used, outside of extreme situations where the U-2 wouldn't be capable, the latter of which that is still used today. However, more fringe people have said that the US Air Force went on to develop an aircraft called the Aurora. Flying at beyond Mach 6 at 135,000 feet, this black triangle of a spy plane would use a new type of engine. They called it a pulse wave detonation engine, and it leaves a very unique contrail that you might have seen. By exploding fuel behind the aircraft, the jet can ride forwards like a surfer, reaching impressive speeds. Apparently, this aircraft went through a few variants, with one called the SR-75 that would have a mothership carrier that would carry the Aurora on top of itself, followed by a version that could also operate as a single-stage suborbital aircraft. Yes, going up to space essentially. Reports of sightings were seen up to around the 90s, where allegedly the Air Force wrapped up testing and decided to move onwards to the next aircraft, the SR-72. Now, what we know is this program is a real thing. It's also known as the Son of the Blackbird, or in the latest Top Gun Maverick film, the Dark Star. Traveling over our heads around a hypersonic speed of Mach 7, it is the future of spy plane technology. It can cross the hemisphere in 1 hour, enter any country unnoticed, and be out before the jets can even get into the sky. And because it's now a drone aircraft without a pilot, it will be able to perform some impressive high-G maneuvers. It may also carry hypersonic missiles that will allow it to strike deep within enemy territory before they even know that it's taken off. And the most crazy part is, it may even be flying right now. In 2007, a Lockheed executive said that we've been saying hypersonics are 2 years away for the last 20 years, but all I can say is that the technology is finally mature, meaning that they've had the engine tech for the last 5 to 6 years, and if history of the SR-71 is anything to go by, the successor, the SR-72, is already flying and will only be declassified in 20 years. So let me know down in the comments if you believe this too. So with a new hypersonic drone aircraft on the way, the spirit of the SR-71 Blackbird lives on, and I for one can't wait to look up to the sky one night and double take what I just saw. Thanks for watching.